Aloha again, 206ers. Welcome to the Poetry Hall Pass lecture series. Today's lecture-sode was going to be called Muse in Place, like our unit. But one thing poets sometimes do is, when in doubt, you just change the thing to the opposite. So we're going to call today's episode Pandemic Roller Girl. I'm not sure how it is with you, but ever since we went through the lockdown, shutdown period, I started making a list of all the things that I really wanted to do when things went back to somewhat normal. One of those was I live not too far from the lakefront arena, and they sometimes have roller derby matches there, which I've never been to. So that's on my list. And the lakefront arena, of course, is the site of where Delgado's commencement and many graduations just didn't happen this spring. All right? So now, if you were, we need to start with a definition of poetry, or maybe each episode will have a different definition. But, there's only two types of writing: poetry and prose. If you were taking my autobiography class, we would start with, if you can see this, Mr. T by Mr. T, which is the life of Mr. T as told by Mr. T in sentences and paragraphs, and then it makes a book, and that's what we call prose. Poetry, of course, has its own special features formally, which we'll get into, things like sometimes rhyme, rhythm, line breaks, stanzas, all these formal features of poetry that are unique to our regular everyday writing. So I guess one definition of poetry is that, because we'll start by talking about the muses, the Greek ladies who would come down to people and inspire them in all the different art forms. So one definition of poetry is it's the exact opposite of being eaten by another human being. What I mean by that is, some of you have been exposed to Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid from your other classes, like psychology or sociology, right? You have the pyramid, and something like this, where you have basic needs on the bottom: food, water, air, respiration. And then going up the pyramid, we get to things like safety and shelter, and then you becoming your best self, actualizing all the way to the top. And for the most part, when we start with talking about the muses and art and poetry, we're talking about all the things at the top of the pyramid that you have the luxury when you have the luxury of being beyond just surviving. But of course, we're in this moment now where there's a little bit of everything going on at once, right? You're trying to actualize yourself and move on, and this whole viral outbreak is happening at the same time. I myself lost one of the most beloved people in my life, my aunt, who was my godmother. She didn't die of COVID-19, but she did die. And, the sad part was all the terrible things that are going on at this time, such as her sons and daughters not being able to visit her in the hospital. All that was in play. At the very beginning of this lockdown, I also lost one of my favorite dogs. I mean, all dogs of mine would be my favorite, but I lost one of my special dogs. And so, the poem we start with is a poem called One Art. by Elizabeth Bishop, in which she says, the art of losing isn't hard to master. And then the question there is, we'll get back to, is how serious or not is she being about that statement. We start with the Muses, and they're 9. There's streets in New Orleans named for them. There's a parade named for them, and they're all ladies from Greek mythology, and they have cool names. And so we start with a lot of female poets, just because. One of those poets, Harriet Mullen, wrote a book called Muse and Drudge, which I think I talked about a little bit last hall lecture. The first unit is called Muse in Place because we just all went through this historic moment of being locked down. And some of the initial poems we read reflect that. Elizabeth Bishop's piece about losing things, Emily Dickinson, who was notoriously solitary, like mostly didn't leave her house, not because of this situation, but just because. We could look into all the reasons why. But she mostly stayed at home and wrote poems, and most of them didn't get published till after her death. Maureen Owen wrote a book called The No Travels Journal, in which she recently had all these children, so she was mostly sort of housebound. I mean, not all the time, but she would fantasize about all the places around the world she would get to go to. And Carrie Chappelle recently wrote some poems from her apartment in Paris. She's originally from the United States, I believe Alabama, but she's lived in Paris for a while, and she wrote these poems while stuck in her apartment, which is something that, it's very timely. So all these things are in play. That's where we start. The big thing to pick up on something I started on last time was, the first thing is just start with the music. A lot of times if you like a song, you may not know the meaning of every word to that song or even know all the words to that song, but you know the chorus or you know some cool part that you like. So the same with poetry. You don't have to necessarily know every single thing that the author meant or intended. What we like to call meaning. I can tell you from a poet's perspective, a lot of times you just aren't even trying to have any sort of deep meaning. But the music is a good place to start. And the other thing with that is, you're not going to like all the poets you read, and that's fine. Just the same way that you don't like all the music you hear. Find the ones that you like, and you'll be able to drill down on those a little bit more as we go on. A couple things I'm thinking of in a general sense is, as far as, school in the summertime, by doing this, you're violating the Fat Albert rule, right? It was like an insult from Fat Albert, which was, you're like school in the summertime, no class. But of course, Fat Albert took place in Philadelphia. And in the northern United States, the summer's the best time of year because, like somewhere like Chicago, they go through 8 or 9 months of freezing, terrible weather. So in the summer is like, wow, it's like the time to get out there and do everything. In the South, and especially in New Orleans, it's almost kind of reversed. I always thought that we should have off between Halloween and Mardi Gras because the summer's in some ways like our worst time of year, unless you're in water or have a snowball going into your mouth. Maybe both simultaneously. Maybe a snowball while you're going down the slip and slide. If that's not happening, this is our hottest time of year, our most uncomfortable. So in a weird way, you might as well take a class. So you're smart enough to do that. So give yourself one of these, I'm trying to bring that back. Maybe make a boomerang of that after you read a poem. When we think about college, just some general thoughts. I heard sort of an expert on the subject talking the other day, and they're talking about there's really like three aspects to the college education. You have the credentialing aspect, which is, you take a class, you get credit for it, or you get certified for a very particular course in a very particular field. And then you're able to show that and say, I have the credentials now to do this, either a degree, job, or whatever you're trying for. There's the education part. Lo and behold, this is the crazy part. This is like actually learning something. That's kind of a wild idea, but that's the education part at the heart. And then there's the experience part, which, of course, if you were traditionally going to a school, that's all the social life and student life that goes with that. Classic example, if you went to LSU in the fall, you're going to football games, you're hanging out in the outdoor amphitheater with a friend, reading and studying, all that stuff, campus life. So by taking a class online, we can't, fully have that third component, but we can definitely have the credentialing part, and we can have as much of the education part as we can possibly achieve, right? Now, I'm not sure if you're still, one thing I should say is anytime we have these lecture things like this, I recommend sometimes, I find it really easy to listen to podcast or radio interviews for a pretty long time. So I would almost sometimes just, turn up the volume, and then you don't have to watch me like standing in this hallway. It's probably like easier to concentrate for a little bit longer. I am waiting for somebody to walk through my front door, and if they do, they might save you from the moment that's about to happen, which is me possibly ruining Emily Dickinson for you before I even start.